Well, this just in. Sean Diddy Combs has been sentenced to 4 years and 2 months in prison. He was convicted of organizing drug-fueled sex parties across state lines. Jurors acquitted him of racketeering, conspiracy, and sex trafficking charges.
Yeah, former U.S. Attorney Zachary Myers joining us now with a closer look at the case in today's sentencing. Zachary, good to see you. Thanks so much for coming by.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me.
So what happens next in this?
So now that the defendant's been convicted of these 2 counts and he's been sentenced to over 4 years in prison, the Bureau of Prisons is going to take a look at his history, the recommendations of the court. They'll decide what federal prison to send him to somewhere. Really, it could be anywhere in the country. And he's going to serve at least 85% of that sentence, minus the time he's been sitting in jail pending trial. He's going to spend that time in custody, and then he'll be released in the community. But he's going to be supervised by probation officers for several years and is likely to have to register as a sex offender under local law.
What a downfall.
How does federal sentencing work?
So on the federal side of things, the Congress sets the maximum penalties, and here, where the defendant was acquitted of the more serious in terms of penalty charges, he could have faced 15 years to life in prison, and instead he was facing a maximum of 20 years. But the judge has discretion of where in that 20 years to sentence him, and the prosecutors wanted more than 10 years in prison, and the defense was arguing essentially for time served and for him to be released. And in fact, allegedly had organized a speaking event for him in Miami next week.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, because they were seeking, 11 years behind bars, right, I believe. So how did they come to 4? So
the judge is going to take a lot of things into account in coming up with a sentence. There's a statute that tells the judge not just to look at the advisory sentencing guidelines, but to look at all the facts surrounding the event. And when you have a trial, the judge sat through weeks of hearing from the testimony from the victims, but he also saw, for example, the video that the defendant and his people played, he read the letters from victims, from the defense, from his family, and the judge, took all these things into account and let the government argue, let the defense argue, and then made his determination where in that range he thought was appropriate.
Go ahead.
The public might be asking, why so little time? Any surprises here as far as the sentencing goes?
Well, the judge came down sort of somewhere in the middle of the 2 requests, which is, I think, common. But because he was only convicted of the interstate transportation of individuals for commercial sex, the sentence imposed of 4 years is actually a fairly high sentence in the context of those kinds of offenses. The offenses he was acquitted of, the offenses involving using force, fraud, coercion, or racketeering, that faced the much higher penalties, would have resulted in being in prison much longer. But for what he was convicted of, this actually is a fairly lengthy sentence. And as the judge said, he wanted to impose a substantial sentence because he thought it was appropriate, given all the evidence that he heard at trial and given the violence inflicted on the victims.
From a legal and maybe a technician standpoint, you mentioned that video, right? That kind of changes the game when you're talking about trials. How did that play a role?
Well, the defense prepared a documentary-style video that they played for the court ahead of time. I think the jury is still out on whether those sorts of presentations are persuasive to the judge who ultimately makes the decision, or does the judge feel like they've been doing this for a long time, they've seen what happened in court, and they can make their own determination. So, every judge is different, every case is different, and defense counsel are going to have to decide what they think is going to get, and the government, what they think is going to get the most persuasive version of their case in front of the fact finder.
All right.
Fascinating conversation.
Former U.S. Attorney Zachary Myers, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Very interesting.